Hi everyone. Just making sure that we're good. So I'm Indio. I guess I'll be presenting today on HEOR and market access. I'm a second year postdoctoral fellow now, so should have some years under the belt. But um, yeah, I can hop straight into it. So I don't know if you want to go over this many or if we can just go straight to the next slide.
You can
Or
skip this, that's fine.
okay. So first thing I was going to do was the background of myself, and we can hop straight. So I have a dual degree in PharmD MBA with an accelerated program. And I, like many other people, went to a more clinically focused school. So you'll see that a lot with a lot of applicants, a lot of that they didn't necessarily have a lot of industry experience in terms of support from their school, but they were able to make it work just given their creativity and applying skills that they've developed to what industry is looking for. And I was the same way. I did find a way to get a few industry internships just per going out and finding these opportunities, networking with professionals and so forth. I had one in HEOR, one in managed care, and then one in medical affairs. In terms of leadership at the more local level, I was involved with IPHO and AMCP at my school, the local levels, and some national involvement as well. Some additional experience I had was research projects and poster presentations. I was able to complete around 4 of those, and four of those, 3 of them, I was the lead researcher on there. So I was able to present my own work, if that makes sense. Academically, I was an average to above average student. I wasn't necessarily in high, but I wasn't unable to do well at school, if that makes sense. I was the type to get A's to B's in my classes. Nothing really below a B ever. And I ended up knowing what I was doing most of the time. Aside of the internships, though, of course, I had a community internship like many people had. So obviously it taught me a lot about retail, but also the fact that I didn't want to do retail, which is very helpful. And then my 4th year, in terms of APPEs, I had one in medical affairs, which was more related to drug information. So still, a little controversial on if that really is medical affairs, but it was classified in that way. And then I had one in managed care, of course, and then I had a couple of them focused on oncology, which really pushed me towards more specialty-based therapeutic area. So if anyone has questions, feel free to drop in the chat and let me know. Feel free to interrupt. But that was my experience before I was able to join fellowship. I'll talk a bit more about what exactly I did, and then what exactly I do now as a fellow. But that's a bit of background about myself. So why I chose to do industry. The way I looked at industry is that when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do going into pharmacy school, but also going out of pharmacy school, I really wanted to make sure that I was consistently excited about what I was doing. And to me, that meant that I needed a lot of opportunity for personal growth. And so industry really provided that opportunity for me, and it also provided a dynamic environment in the sense that you're not necessarily going to be stuck doing the same type of work for your entire career, where you might see that a lot more with community and in hospital, where once you kind of start the job, you kind of know what's coming, the types of things that you do every day. For example, with community, you kind of have that process and protocols that are set in place. But with industry, it's more about like what you learn, what do you want to do next, and then trying to find those opportunities to develop that. Which brings me to my next point was that a lot of what I'm learning now, and then things that even professionals now will learn, because if we really think about it, learning is like a never-ending process once you're in industry. But what I really liked is that I was more flexible with what I can learn outside of the clinical scope. So obviously I knew enough clinically, given that you get trained in pharmacy school and so forth, to to be a clinician, but outside of that, things that aren't necessarily clinical related. In this case, with HEOR and market access, you learn things that are more quantitative in nature. You learn how to think about problems a bit differently outside of a clinician's point of view. You learn, obviously develop more of an enterprise mindset as you're working, for an enterprise in itself. And you kind of get to do that at your own pace, especially with the fellowship. You have a lot of opportunity to develop with, a longer leash. You can make more mistakes and so forth. And that's kind of what I really was looking for when I did a fellowship versus trying to apply directly to industry. You can shape your development a lot better. And it's also a more streamlined and I would say operationally like a set way to enter the field versus trying to defend your experience as a clinician, as a PharmD, to an audience that may not be as familiar with it. And that's also one of my last points here is that I really like the idea of expanding what a pharmacist can do outside of the typical community and hospital-based fields. And you'll see this a lot. Like PharmDs are obviously excelling in a variety of different functions, from medical affairs to regulatory affairs to commercial. And that really applies here as well. Being understand the scientific story about what's going on has been really helpful for me in applying to my work. And it set me apart from even professionals that have been doing this for a while. So that's a bit about why I want to do industry. In terms of why I want to do HEOR market access specifically, I had more adjacent interests in more of the quantitative side and in the math and statistics and economic side, and kind of how healthcare paradigm shifts, so how things like policy affect the type of work that industry is doing, how exactly value is attributed. And also alongside that, I found that with my experience in HEOR, managed care, and so forth, I had the more opportunities to really to practice creative problem solving. In that sense, a lot of the problems aren't really solved the same way. You might have some similar deliverables for every indication or product that you work on, but a lot of them are different challenges. And each of those challenges you don't necessarily take on by yourself, but you take on as part of a cross-functional team that each has their different priorities and what they want to achieve, but you all have to compromise with each other. You all have to think about, defend why exactly you need to do certain things, spend certain budgets where you want to spend certain budgets, and so forth. And that really was fascinating to me. With HEOR market access, it's obviously a growing field in terms of importance to the industry, especially with all the policy that's going on now. So it's an even more defined opportunity to practice problem solving. Another aspect why I liked HEOR market access is that I noticed a lot of professionals in the field had pretty diverse backgrounds, and I see it a lot within my team. A lot of them had different levels of experience that led to them being in a similar type of role. And each of them's background provided them a unique perspective, a unique edge. So I was, happy to add to that pot. There weren't many pharmacists on my team, and many of them that weren't necessarily recent graduates. I was able to demonstrate more of a clinical prowess in terms of solving my problems and so forth. And being on the younger side, I was able to adapt to more of the interesting initiatives, such as utilizing AI, like many functions are in many different companies. So that's a bit about why I liked HEOR market access. I liked the challenges that it really represented. And for a bit of background, what HEOR and access really, kind of is that, HEOR is more about, this is a very broad definition, but it's more about demonstrating the value of the treatments and the views of different stakeholders. So not just from the payer perspective, but also from, the medical perspective, patient perspective, and so forth, and obviously the industry's perspective. And access is more about bridging that gap between maximizing patient access and making sure as many patients as possible get this medication. But at the same time, you optimally reflect and procure the value of those medications. So more it's a lot of back and forth between, do we want a larger patient population at a lower price, and vice versa. And it's mostly about making sure everyone is maximizing their value, because at the end of the day, you're a company that needs to fund further innovation, and that's what really market access does, is making sure that's done in a way that maximizes that. So that's a bit of background about why I want to do industry, why I want to do HEOR market access specifically. Now, when it came to applying for these HEOR market access opportunities, I can go through my process, and I know this is a bit of order slide, so feel free to interrupt me with questions if you need. So the first thing I did, or I guess the first subject of an application is, of course, the deliverables, which are the CV, letter of intent, and letter of recommendation. So for my experience, I started the CV and letter of intent process pretty early. And when I say started, I mean like I completed the process 1 to 2 months before. So I started, June, July, so forth, and I usually finish around August, September. So how I did it was that obviously had my completed CV, completed letter of intent, and then I just put it through the grinder with several rounds of peer and fellow professional review. So I usually started with peer review, just given the fact that they would be capturing a lot of the stuff that, a lot of the easy stuff that I might not have missed, or that I might have missed, and then fellows, and obviously professional review, and subsequently. So I think I went around 5 to 6 rounds total of revisions, and before I had my finalized CV. Another point I want to mention here, especially with the CV letter of intent, is that there's not really going to be a perfect letter of intent or perfect CV that you write, but there are bad ones in the sense that you can tell when something is more half-assed or more low quality versus something that's been obviously revised and intentional with what it's saying. You'll always find something that you would want to change with a CV, but in terms of knowing when exactly it's objective versus subjective is important to know. And that's what you have to get with your rounds of revisions. You can't just do it with just your own eyes because you'll be a bit more biased in that sense. For the letter of recommendation segment, I reached out to my writers pretty early. I think I confirmed my writers in June and just ensured that they would be comfortable with what exactly the rough timelines were, and then obviously once those timelines were set, I communicated that to them very timely, and so I denoted out in my request, these are the types of skills that I've developed under you, and this is the type of skills that I want you to emphasize during my letter of recommendation. For those that are considering getting recommendations from those that you'll be doing rotations under, I would obviously recommend that you perform as well as you can. Make sure that make sure your soft skills are developed well there so that they like you, they're memorable, and so that the letter of recommendation that they write for you is obviously optimal. None of my letter of recommendation writers were people I did rotations with, so I didn't really run into this issue specifically. But you can tell based on how you perform on the rotation, how comfortable you were, if it's a good idea for you to get your letter of recommendation from them. In terms of how I targeted fellowships, when I applied, there's obviously relatively limited amount of roles available. I think around 15 to 20 that I was interested in total. So I wasn't really super picky in the sense that I would quickly take out a role that I was potentially interested in. But obviously I was looking for more HEOR access specific roles. And with HEOR and access, you'll find that, or at least I found from both sides of the aisle, is that the applicants tend to be a bit more prepared and on higher end, if that makes sense. Usually the applicants will know what they're doing. They'll have more experience. They'll understand the role a bit more than just the surface level. And so you'll obviously have a little bit more competition in that sense. Even though the application count might not be anywhere near the size of a function like medical affairs or marketing or so forth. The applicants that you will be competing with, especially when it gets to more of the end, are very high quality candidates. I tended to prefer fellowships with more specialty therapeutic areas, but I didn't necessarily exclude those that weren't. So specialty therapeutic areas were fields like oncology, immunology, and rare disease. So things that were a bit more unique. That's what really stood out to me. That's why I wanted to take part in. In terms of the roles themselves, I tend to prefer a bit more access-oriented roles versus the more pure HEOR roles. And I also targeted programs that seem to have better reputations for developing fellows. And this is something that you would find out like through conversations with the fellows that they had, looking at the brochures to see where exactly the fellows go. And just it's a lot of it's qualitative, right? So you have to make sure you ask those more hard-hitting questions on how exactly they feel when they're in the program, seeing what exactly worked for them, seeing what didn't work, and so forth. So it can be within program variable, but can also be by program itself. Next thing I did was prepare for interviews. So what I recommend was to produce like 4 to 5 adaptable stories that you can use for different STAR questions. This is seen a lot in terms of recommendations, but it can't really be understated that having adaptable stories that you haven't really memorized is the best way to go, especially for STAR questions that you may not be familiar with. It's going to be pretty difficult to memorize a response to 100 different STAR questions versus having 4 to 5 stories that you can apply to 100 different STAR questions. That's my recommendation there. Next thing I would do is I would try to become comfortable with my elevator speech in the sense that I didn't necessarily make it sound rehearsed, but I knew exactly what I was going to say, what I wanted to mention during the minute long answer, as well as the why answers. So pretty much every fellowship opportunity is going to ask you, why industry, why functional area, and why company. And you want to make sure that your answers are not only brief, but also personable and make sense. It's not necessarily something that's cookie cutter. So my recommendation there is to just keep in touch with what exactly the company is doing, your conversations with previous members like fellows or professionals at the company and so forth. Try to really have like a clear understanding of why exactly you're doing it outside the fact that they're just offering a fellowship. It's something that seems pretty difficult, but you also want to make sure that you properly research to have this. And speaking of research, like I said, do a lot of research on the program itself, but also the company. Know what exactly the type of company it is. If it's like a smaller to larger company, what exactly are their bigger products? What types of therapeutic areas do they tend to specialize? What areas are they trying to move into? Staying on top of their current events of the field itself. So, for example, if HEOR and access, being aware of policy that's affecting those fields, such as like the IRA, understanding like 340B, understanding this new most favorable nation policy that's being rolled out, and so forth. Something like that I would say being able to do that is a pretty good tool to have when you prepare for interviews, because they want to make sure that you're thinking about the field more critically. From my experience, I'll say this just to encourage everyone to practice, but I could have practiced more during my interviews, and that's my biggest recommendation right now. I thought I could wing it a bit more than I should have, and I obviously paid a little bit more with worse interviews. So that's my big recommendation. Practice with your peers, practice with yourself, practice with your mentors. There's really no way to over practice. Just obviously it's just clear cut. Just practice interviewing, practice answering your why questions in your speech, as well as different STAR questions. You can even use like ChatGPT, for example, to judge your answers and so forth. For resources that I used for the application process, I used Discord. So servers like this is a good start. I used obviously ADP server. I know some of us are already aware of that. The servers are pretty helpful for more candid advice, especially since it's anonymous. You could ask dumb questions and get more brutal, critical responses. And that's going to be a bit better than trying to ask a mentor that's going to give you a more PC answer. So even for little things that I found that to be pretty useful. Stuff like knowing when exactly to send thank you notes to fellows, how exactly I should be adapting my answers, so forth. Once it gets to like the mid-year segment, how exactly do you handle that, and so forth. What also I found useful was to be very clear and candid with not only my fellow competing candidates, but also the fellows involved. Um, Even if you don't move forward with the position, you still gained a contact that you can ask for advice, and they will be able to help out a lot. When it came to like final round presentations, for example, I practiced a lot, even with people that I was within the same function competing with, just to make sure that it made sense. I was able to get a few practice runs in, and I found that to be immensely helpful for securing the position that I have now. If I didn't really know anything, I would obviously go to Google and Reddit and YouTube. I would try to find the answer out myself before, asking others. And that's something I recommend because it's also a good life skill to have. You'll be able to, make sure that you look better because you've taken steps to understand what exactly you were curious about. I found that pretty useful for fellowship applications as well because a lot of the times other people had the same question, and it saved me a bit of face right before I had to ask someone else. Other tips is that during the process it can become really stressful, so just find healthy ways to be able to relieve stress in that sense. Things like hobbies and so forth, making sure that you're not worrying too much about the process itself because that's how you're going to burn yourself out. And then the second tip I had was to not be afraid to show your personality and what makes you interesting. At the end of the day, what the fellowship people are looking for is someone that they want to teach, and they don't want to teach a robot. They want to teach someone that they can get along with, that they can go to happy hour with, that they can hang out with outside of work, and that they can have a conversation because that's how you get the most candid feedback, but also that's how you actually develop the best. You don't want to be someone with poor social skills that can't really contribute outside of your team meetings, if that makes sense. Let me go to the next slide. So from my experience, I applied to 17 positions and I got interviews at all 17. And then I went down to 12 round twos, 4 final rounds, and I was able to get 2 offers. Interviews are primarily virtual outside of a couple of final rounds, and obviously you have your in-person receptions at mid-year. For final rounds, I did presentations. It really depends on the program and the role that you're in. I did presentations on different policy developments, did a journal club on some provided studies, and some similar types of presentations. So it really just depends. And like I said, it's best to get those done ahead of time. Make sure you know a lot of background information about your things so you can answer questions, especially if you're interviewing for a program where you get grilled, but also to practice that with as many people as you can. And why I chose the program that I chose is that they were very, very committed to my development. Each preceptor had a clear, defined role in what they would be doing, and they all had different backgrounds as well, so I can learn something different from each one of them. So it's very personalized in that sense. One was more day-to-day, one was more personal development, like professional development, and one was more big picture. So they were good about making sure I was getting visibility, and any like big changes I wanted to make, I could do that. The program's in my therapeutic area of choice. The company that I'm with has a pretty strong pipeline within the therapeutic area, and even their current portfolio is pretty strong. So I knew it was a very solid track record of what it was doing in this space, and that's something that I liked, was that stability there. The program itself had a pretty strong track record post-fellowship. It also had a decent or an optimal program size with resources. It wasn't a lot of fellows, but it also wasn't just a few. And that's what I really liked because I was able to develop close friendships with all the fellows that I'm with now, but there's also a decent amount of them, so you're not really stuck with the same people every time. My specific program was also like pretty newer, so I was able to carve more areas out for development and begin the initiative. So all the fellows that would come behind me would kind of have my experience to learn from, and they can carve their own experience from that. So what worked for me may work for them. The areas that didn't really work for me, they would know to avoid, and so forth. Okay. So for my fellowship itself, it's a 2-year program. It's not really oriented with rotations. It's more oriented based on what I'm doing and a more fluid nature. And I, like many fellows, are doing work based on business need at the time. So it's a bit of a compromise between what you want to do versus what makes sense for the company in terms of placing you where they need resources. I primarily work within different franchise teams, and with that, I naturally carved out a more leading role on projects in 1 to 2 franchises versus support. Like I said, I had multiple preceptors of different roles. One was day to day, one was more big picture, and one was more personal technical development. In terms of networking opportunities within and outside the company, it was pretty standard. There are company-oriented events like this that aim to improve your development, but there's also team-oriented stuff, and you also have all the assorted events that comes with being in a fellowship. So most fellowships will have internal committees that you take part in, and they will also develop events that are aimed for improving networking capabilities. Within my team, I went to all the expected congresses that are relevant to my field, and then at those congresses, there are opportunities for networking, not just within my team, but also outside of my company as well. And so they're pretty good about setting that up. In terms of the personal, in terms of the way I'm really taught, it's more of a partnership method within my fellowship. So I will lead and assist projects, even if it's for the first time. And then I will have supporting individuals or supporting professionals that will, obviously provide feedback, making sure that they're aware of what's going on. And as you get more experience, you'll be leading and assisting more projects. So you'll obviously know a bit more about what you're doing. The goals for the program itself was designed for me to become flexible within different roles within teams in terms of knowledge and how to develop myself. So more of an adaptable individual versus a kind of a carved into a specific role. And obviously types of roles are typical of a fellowship like this is entry-level / semi-entry-level roles in HEOR and access. And when I say entry-level, I mean entry-level in the sense of post-fellowship, not necessarily right off of graduating pharmacy school. Skills I really developed were obviously the technical HEOR skills, but also knowledge and how to apply those skills to pricing and access decision-making as part of a cross-functional team. So it's a lot more application-based versus doing pure research. Okay, in terms of the onboarding, so how I transitioned into the role is mostly just being based on how comfortable I was feeling. And for me, learning is very much an ongoing process. So it really just depended on the task I was doing, how quickly I was able to handle them and understand them, and so forth. The way I look at it is that it's really dangerous to think that you know what you're doing too early on. In reality, fellows are still bottom of the totem pole, at least within my team, in terms of experience and ability to do things. Even if you develop your understanding, you still have lots of people that are very, very well versed in what they're doing. So you want to obviously have a seat at the table, but you also want to be aware that just because you learn how to do something once, it doesn't mean that you're an expert on how to do it yet. Some of the tasks took me like maybe around a month to be able to do super well versus some are longitudinal, some are more few months long. The types of projects I did within the first few months were a bit more above brand projects. So designed to really introduce the concepts of the field while still competing in impactful work. So all of the above and brand initiatives I would be a bit of a part of. And so I could understand what exactly the business was doing, why exactly I was doing it, and so forth. And the focus is really about getting up to speed on the technical skills and more about how the company works. And obviously meeting team members, not just within my team, but also adjacent teams. My initial impressions are, of course, developing an imposter syndrome. The way I looked at it is that joining fellowship meant that, with this notion I have, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. I really, really was seeking that out. And I found that to be very true, especially during the initial stages of the fellowship. I was, obviously in rooms with people with tons of experience, tons of education, and so forth. that seemed to know exactly what they're doing, what to say, what kind of critical thinking that they needed. And obviously that's still the case, but it's also a bit more understandable at this point in time for me. So that was my initial impression. Is just I felt like very out of my depth. I was like, what am I doing here? How could I get this fellowship? Why would they pick me? I don't know what I'm doing. When much of the work really required just either higher technical prowess or familiarity with the back-end decision making. So I did lots of looking up things and asking questions, especially after meetings and discussions with my preceptor, just to get up to speed in the ways of working, what exactly they're talking about, so I can follow along during meetings and so forth. Currently, how I feel is that everyone's even smarter than they seem, but I'm smarter than I seem too. I obviously wanted to give myself credit there, because I'm able to function as a core member of the team, but there's still lots of things to learn. I can understand why and how things are done, especially within my team in terms of projects and deliverables and timelines. And I currently can lead and contribute to a cross-functional team even without higher up support for things that I lead. So I'm able to lead those types of discussions, and that's pretty useful now versus when I started fellowship. And I'm a lot more confident now in communicating to senior leadership. So people like my skip levels and people at those levels outside of my team that have no idea what a fellow is, I'm able to operate in that sphere as well. What I found also is that visibility is pretty much just as important as competence. So knowing how to do a job is really good, but also very important to make sure that people that have influence understand that what you're doing is important. So I would say to just obviously don't be afraid to show off, but also don't try to overly flex. The capabilities that you have are still very well known to these people, right? Especially if you're working with them on a more consistent basis. But it doesn't mean that you can't take credit for things that you've done. So it's a bit of a balance there, obviously. But I found that to be pretty useful. A lot of times it's just fellows come in, it's like, okay, I need to grind and just make sure that I get all my work done so people don't think I'm a bad worker. But then they end up in 6 months in and most of their team doesn't really know who they are. So you run into that issue itself. So make sure that people are aware of you, especially within your team. I also recommend finding a niche that you're pretty exceptional in. So finding a gap or weakness within your team, something that they need more expertise on, and doing your best to develop or to fill that gap. The aim there is to just be memorable, be the guy to go to. So I still get questions on certain topics that I've developed into a niche that I'm pretty good at outside of my indication. And being more of a part of the team, part of the fabric of that is pretty useful. So those are my current impressions of my fellowship so far. In terms of a week of the life of what I do, obviously, like everybody else in the industry, my weeks are very dynamic, dependent on the projects and time of the year. For example, during the holiday time, such as this period right now, obviously end of the year, like December and so forth, it's a bit slower in terms of meetings, but you still have a lot of tasks to do and catch up on. How it's usually set up for me is I have obviously a set of recurring meetings, obviously with my preceptors. It depends on what you need from your preceptor. I have it bi-weekly because I don't necessarily work with them directly, but they're more of a people management perspective. You have your team and sub-team meetings, and then obviously like you have your company-wide town halls and development sessions. And then you also have your fellowship committee responsibilities itself. So for some companies, like I said, their programs will have internal committees designed to serve different functions, and you being able to stay on top of that is also necessary. In terms of my project meetings, it really just depends on the work stream and need for updates of the supporting teams. So this is variable. And obviously you have your cross-functional team meetings, which depend on what exactly you need to contribute at that time. For example, this morning, I presented to a cross-functional team with clinical people, with commercial people, with medical people, and so forth, and showing them from the access perspective, what I'm working on, what exactly is needed from them, and it rotates around, right? So being able to do that is useful. My free time is obviously catching up on work, doing things that can't really do during a call. Also, aid and mentoring the first year fellows within my team, mostly in the sense of getting their technical training up to speed, even though it's been around a month or so. So being able to get them up, to understand what exactly you need to do for my role specifically. Also take time to seek feedback from team members that aren't involved in my current projects, mostly to get feedback on what I'm working on. It's always great to get different eyes on what you're doing, but also it's great from the networking perspective because you're reaching out and asking them for advice, right? And so you want to be able to establish that relationship with them to say, okay, this person wouldn't be able to get this job done without my help, my advice, and you want to develop that positive image of yourself. So other than that, I also, have professional development activities of my own. I won't go too far into it just to, not dock myself, but things that will help me later on in my career. I'm developing and learning for myself. That's my usual week. It's very dynamic. Some weeks are very, very busy. Some weeks I'm very relaxed and I can log off around 5 and, enjoy myself, but you never know. In terms of skill building, these are skills I've kind of developed for at least over the fellowship. Obviously improving communication, executive presence, but also thinking about flexibility and time management is pretty useful, especially when you have a more packed schedule and you have a lot of different tasks that have different deadlines and so forth. And each of these things needs different people's involvement with their own busy schedules. But also thinking about critical thinking. Like I said earlier on in presentation, with HEOR and market access, you have a lot of creative problem solving. So being able to think dynamically and how to solve these problems is something that I developed pretty well. And also, like many other fellows and many professionals, you end up having to manage a budget at some point in your time as your role. So being able to understand how exactly that budget, where exactly the budget comes from, what exactly you can use it for in terms of activities and tasks and deliverables, and actually implementing that budget. So thinking about stuff like contracting, vendor management, and so forth. That's something that I developed. It's pretty interesting when you're, obviously have like less than a year of experience to like less than 2 years of experience, but you have to manage people with, working at these vendors, working at these contracting sites with much more experience than you. So being able to understand that and go with the flow there is pretty useful, and I found to be pretty effective. In terms of hard skills, obviously my knowledge of the therapeutic area has skyrocketed, especially within the sub-teams, sub-franchises that I'm in. And then my HEOR and access knowledge is obviously improved. With HEOR, I'm a lot more comfortable with biostats, EPI, and obviously economics, running models and so forth, and understanding how to read them, how to develop them, and also learning new research methodologies and applications, and how that translates to the work I'm doing now. In terms of access knowledge, learned a lot more about how PBM and HTA decision making takes place, what goes into pricing, and how you develop pricing policy, both in the US and ex-US, and also how to communicate in the US and ex-US. What are the different priorities, especially different cross-functionally, what they're prioritizing as well. And then for my role itself, the core deliverables, knowing how to construct them and why they're constructed, that's something I developed as a hard skill. So in terms of networking as a fellow, why networking is really important is that pharma is obviously pretty small and the HEOR and access is much smaller. Peers that I have, especially fellows, tend to know each other. So when it comes to application season, you'll tend to know who exactly is applying where and when and who's going where. And so you never really know where those new opportunities are going to be coming from. So having a solid reputation, being yourself, being genuine is very, very key here. And that's also why networking is important as well. You want to be well known and known as a good worker, but also known. So when people have an opening, they know who to go to. In terms of networking opportunities, like I said, I have a lot of face time with this, obviously the site-based team that I'm in, but also with other fellows, especially really early on. I had freedom to set up one-on-ones with anyone on my team. They're very, very supportive and willing to learn about what I can bring to the table and also support what I'm doing. And if they have additional projects that they would find interesting for me to take part in, they're pretty good about making sure that I'm up to speed on that and can help out. And senior leadership itself obviously provided very strong support, and they're very aware of my work. They're always looking to see what I'm doing and to see if they can implement what I'm doing as well as quickly as possible. How do I really use networking? Is I utilize a lot of one-on-ones to find new projects and new support for current projects. It's always, like I said, good to get a second pair of eyes, even if they're not directly on the project itself. I was able to find a niche of where I can help the team. My goals really were to just make myself memorable and provide awareness of my capabilities, especially as a clinician. I just wanted to be a sponge and someone that can conduct quality work. I wanted to increase the number of team members that had positive feedback regarding my abilities to potentially support my retention odds, but also the more people that you get to know, the more of a candid view you get and how the team operates, what exactly works well, what doesn't work well, what exactly is interesting to them in terms of the field, what my strategies should be, operationally as a fellow, thinking about what's going to be happening next. So those are the key things I was looking for when I was networking. Obviously, you don't want to network just on a surface level, but the connections I've really developed have been pretty sincere and, the type that I know, like even post-fellowship, I'll be able to sustain them. So the key takeaways and final advice that I have is that for fellowship, especially for access and HEOR, it's an ideal way to learn with the freedom to make mistakes and ask stupid questions. If you go straight to FTE, you don't really have that opportunity. Your leash is much shorter. The best experience is really defined from my point of view is performing obviously high quality work, but also having that work be visible to as many people as possible. I also recommend being proactive as it rarely backfires. Obviously, you have to be smart about not overpromising things and not worrying about getting FOMO with certain projects, but being proactive is how you learn the most things. And it really shows that you're a contributing member of the team. Another point I wanted to say is that if you're not really making any mistakes or asking questions, you're not really challenging yourself. And that means that you're doing projects that you're not familiar with is the best thing to do because that's how you learn. If you're doing the same types of projects over and over again, you're not really learning anything. You're just going to be known as a guy that doesn't really challenge himself and take part of anything dynamic and new. With that, you should always be seeking feedback, even if it's just for myself. So if you complete a project and I don't necessarily have an opportunity to ask the people I did the project with for feedback, think about to myself what exactly worked well, what exactly didn't work well. So if I'm running to a similar project or similar work stream or work with the same people again, I know what to do a bit better. And with that, if you're not really enjoying the project that you're doing, especially if it's a longer term project, don't be afraid to speak up and talk to your supporting team, saying this is exactly what I was like ideally picturing with my experience. These are the issues that I'm having. Obviously, it doesn't mean you abandon your project, but it just means that you're not afraid to talk about what exactly you want to do and make sure that your needs are being met. With that, the last couple of points. This first one is, obviously overworking yourself, especially as a fellow, may seem, pretty romantic at that sense, but trying to be busy all the time is like the quickest way to be burnt out, and it's not really the flex that we really think it is. You'll have a lot of fellows that are like, okay, I'm doing all this stuff, but they're not really, contributing as well as they like to. They're not really learning as in-depthly as they need to. And that's just a quick way to get burnt out. It's not going to necessarily increase your retention odds to be working all the time, but the work that you're doing is not very critical, but it's also not very challenging to yourself. Last point I want to say is to just be open to new experiences and just give yourself opportunities outside of your direct team. So working to set up opportunities that could be beneficial for your development. Even if it's not within your core set team. So, for example, I'm working with a similar team that I'm in, but just in a different therapeutic area. So I get to see what exactly they do differently. I get to meet a lot of different people and kind of explain what exactly I do well. And I found that to be pretty useful. Being able to have a diverse set of tasks and projects that you can say that you've completed versus doing 4 or 5 the same things over and over again, I think is pretty useful. So I think that's okay. This is my last slide. So advice for prospective fellows. As you're going into application season, it's pretty useful to be more critical and honest with yourself. I know it's a difficult conversation to have just about your weaknesses so that you can find ways to improve it, and then obviously have room for follow through. So it's a common question, obviously, to get, like, what are your weaknesses? What do you want to improve on? So having that defined and being more introspective within yourself is pretty important. And it's going to make sure that your weaknesses aren't as open during your interviews. Next point was that you should just be interesting outside of your CV. Found that when I was interviewing candidates last year, what I found really interesting wasn't necessarily their CV, but what they brought personally to the table. What are their hobbies? How do they exactly tick? And being able to do that early on is a great way to set yourself apart. Just don't wait obviously until receptions for people to figure out, like, you're not a robot and so forth. That you have things that are interesting about yourself. And that brings me to the next point, is to find ways to relieve stress in productive ways, such as exercise, hobbies, having a good support system. So talking to your friends, family that are supporting you. Networking really starts now, in the sense that impressions are starting to matter now, especially with your one-on-ones that you may be doing with fellows, other professionals. So you want to make sure that you're not really wasting people's time with low-quality conversations and questions. Forming impressions now can translate into interview season, and that could be a difference maker between whether or not you can interview versus moving on to the next round and so forth. Seems superficial, but obviously first impressions matter is a cliche, but it's also very true, especially in these cases. Next point was that you should just manage your time pretty well with rotations and other responsibilities. That means don't over apply to fellowships or stretch yourself too thin. Having 5 quality applications is much better than having 10 bad ones. And this really rings true. I could have applied to more, but I knew I couldn't likely do that, and it ended up working for me. So obviously it's anecdotal, but that's my recommendation there. Just making sure that your time management skills are on par. When your person comes to interview, they're not going to be too concerned about how much busy you are with everything else. It's mostly what you bring to the table during that interview. Next point I want to say is that you should take time to understand deeper than surface level of the functional area that you're applying to. Can you understand what's currently happening in the field and their impact on the function itself? Are you up to date on the different industry trends? Are you knowledgeable on the types of projects the functions do and the basic terminology? And that can be determined, looking at brochures and so forth. Can you understand what exactly they're mentioning in terms of what you'd be doing as a fellow? And if you don't know, what steps are you taking to understand those tasks and responsibilities? The last question is, to ask yourself is, can you critically think through problems? This is also obviously very personal based and individualized, but it's mostly about, okay, for your approach to the problem, within this function, what is your thought process and how to solve it? Can you do that well, or are you struggling with that a lot? And that's something that you need to be able to understand. Last point I said was that you should just be humble with yourself, and you obviously give yourself credit. Like, everyone will get rejected at least once. As you can see, even though I got 17 first round interviews, I only end up getting just a few final rounds. So it's a lot of rejections, and you'll see that with everybody. Not everybody makes it to the final round, right? So, making sure you manage that well and don't take it too hardly. But also, if things are going well for you, be more mindful of other people, they might not have your luck and your ability. So being aware, socially aware in that sense. So I think that covers everything in terms of my lecture. So I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. We had a bit of a lighter session today, so
Hey, Indio, this was
can't really.
fantastic. I learned quite a lot this session. Super interesting, especially given how niche HEOR is as both a function and you know sort of job market, I suppose. Thank you for giving us a grand overview of it. It was really fantastic. I'm not seeing any
Yeah.
questions currently. I do see one person typing, and it's not a question, but rather a congratulations. So I think we're going to end it here today. We did have a pretty good turnout, and I think that's about it.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Benny. Thanks for reaching out to me. If anyone has any questions in the future, obviously feel free to DM me. But yeah, thanks for letting me speak.
Absolutely. Everyone have a good night.
Thanks.